Most people believe they are living by choice, but what if you're actually living by assumption? Not the loud kind, not the ones you announce, but the quiet, unchallenged ideas you carry about yourself, others, and life. Assumptions are powerful because they don't ask for permission. They move like law. You assume people are unreliable, so they prove you right. You assume opportunities are rare, so they seem to disappear. You assume you are almost good enough, and life agrees by giving you almost. And then we say, that's just how life is. But life isn't responding to your words, it's responding to your expectation. Here's the truth. Most people miss you are not reacting to reality. Reality is reacting to you. Every assumption is an instruction. Every expectation is a command. The world doesn't argue, it reflects. If you assume struggle, effort becomes heavy. If you assume rejection, neutral faces look hostile. If you assume success is for others, you'll find 1,000 reasons why today wasn't the day, not because it's true, but because it's assumed, and assumptions, repeated often enough, harden into facts. This is why willpower fails. You can want something desperately and still assume you won't get it, and the assumption always wins, because desire asks, assumption expects. The most dangerous assumptions are the ones that sound reasonable. This is just who I am. People like me don't get that. It's too late. That works for others, not for me. They feel logical, they feel safe, and they quietly run your life. But the moment you become aware of an assumption, it loses its authority. Awareness is the crack in the wall. When you catch yourself thinking, this never works out for me, you've just found the lever, because you can ask a new question. What if that's not a fact, just a habit? What if life has been waiting for a different expectation? When you assume ease, things begin to align. When you assume you are chosen, doors open without force. When you assume you are valued, the world rearranges to confirm it, not magically, naturally, because the outer world must obey the inner agreement. Change doesn't start with action. It starts with permission. Permission to expect differently. Permission to assume success before evidence. Permission to live as though the answer is already yes. The secret isn't controlling life. The secret is realizing you've been doing it the whole time, unconsciously. And the moment you choose your assumptions deliberately, your life stops happening to you and starts happening from you. So choose carefully, because whether you know it or not, your assumptions are already deciding your future. Most people think decisions are loud. They imagine turning points as dramatic moments filled with courage, risk, or action. But the decisions that shape your life most deeply are almost silent. They happen beneath awareness, without ceremony, without debate. These are assumptions. An assumption is a decision you stopped questioning. It is an idea you accepted so long ago that it no longer feels like a choice. It feels like truth. You didn't wake up one day and consciously decide, I am this kind of person, or life works this way for me. You absorbed it from repetition, from emotional moments, from what you observed and quietly agreed with. And once agreed upon, the assumption began to operate automatically. That's why assumptions are so powerful. They don't feel active, they feel passive. Yet they are constantly directing your reactions, your interpretations, and your expectations. An assumption decides how you walk into a room before you speak. It decides what opportunities you notice and which ones you dismiss. It decides how long you persist, how quickly you give up, and what explanations you accept when things don't work out. You may believe you are responding to circumstances, but more often you are responding to what you already assumed those circumstances would be. The mind is always trying to be consistent. Once an assumption is in place, everything is filtered through it. Evidence that supports it is noticed and remembered. Evidence that contradicts it is minimized or ignored. This is why two people can live in the same world and experience entirely different realities. They are not seeing different events, they are seeing through different assumptions. And because assumptions operate automatically, they don't require effort to maintain. You don't have to remind yourself of them. They remind you. They speak in the background as feelings, instincts, gut reactions. They decide what feels possible and what feels unrealistic. They decide what feels like you and what feels foreign or out of reach. This is also why assumptions feel so personal. When one is challenged, it can feel like an attack on identity. To question an assumption is to question the story you've been living inside. So the mind protects them. It calls them logic. It calls them experience. It calls them realism. But realism is often just familiarity wearing a convincing mask. The invisible nature of assumptions is what makes them decisive. If you don't see them, you can't choose them. And if you can't choose them, they choose for you. They quietly vote on every outcome long before action takes place. They decide what feels natural, and life tends to arrange itself around what feels natural to you. Once you understand this, you begin to see that change does not require force. It requires awareness. The moment you notice an assumption, you separate from it. And in that separation, choice returns. Because an assumption can only control your life while it remains unseen. Most people are taught to focus on desire, set goals, want more, visualize what you wish would happen. But wanting has never been the force that shapes a life. Wanting is often a confession of absence. It implies distance, effort, and waiting. Beneath every desire sits a quieter, more influential state, assumption. And life responds to that state, not to what you say you want. You can want confidence and still assume you are awkward. You can want success and still assume it's difficult for you. You can want love and still assume you are overlooked. In each case, the assumption contradicts the desire, and the assumption wins every time. Not because life is unfair, but because expectation carries more authority than hope. Hope asks, assumption expects, and expectation organizes experience. An assumption is the inner answer you've already accepted. It is the feeling of this is how it will go that exists before anything happens. When you assume failure, your body moves differently. Your voice changes. Your timing shifts. You hesitate, overthink, or rush. None of this is intentional. It is alignment. You are aligning with what you expect to be true. This is why people repeat the same patterns even when they genuinely want something else. They are loyal to their assumptions. They assume rejection, so they interpret neutral behavior as dismissal. They assume struggle, so ease feels suspicious or temporary. They assume success requires sacrifice, so they sabotage moments where things flow naturally. Life simply follows the script it's been given. Desire often feels intense, but intensity doesn't equal influence. A quiet assumption held consistently outweighs a passionate wish held occasionally. What you expect when no one is watching, when you're not trying to be positive or hopeful, is what shapes outcomes. Your private expectations are always speaking louder than your public affirmations. This is also why people become frustrated when nothing changes despite effort. They try to change results without anging the inner agreement. They act as though life must prove something to them before they change their expectation. But life is waiting for the expectation first. The order matters. Assumption precedes experience, not the other way around. When you assume something is already settled, your behavior relaxes. You don't chase, you don't force. You move with a quiet certainty that adjusts decisions naturally. Opportunities are noticed because you expect them to exist. Help arrives because you assume you are supported. Resistance fades because there is nothing to fight. To live differently, you don't need to want harder. You need to expect differently. The shift is subtle but decisive. When the inner statement changes from, I hope this works, to, this is how it goes for me, a reality reorganizes. Not instantly, not magically, but inevitably. Because life is not responding to your longing. It is responding to the assumptions you live from every day. Most people experience life as something that happens to them. Events feel random, people feel difficult, and circumstances seem to arrive with opinions and intentions of their own. When something goes wrong, the instinct is to ask, why is this happening to me? That question assumes an enemy, or at least a hostile force. But what if life isn't attacking you at all? What if it's responding? A response is not personal in the way we imagine. It doesn't carry emotion or judgment. It mirrors what it receives. When you see life as, oh, position, you move defensively, you brace yourself, you look for signs of danger, disappointment, or rejection, and because your attention is tuned to those possibilities, you find them, not because they were sent to hurt you, but because you are ready to recognize them. Circumstances have no voice of their own. They speak in the language of interpretation. Two people can face the same event and walk away with completely different meanings. One feels victimized, the other feels redirected. One feels rejected, the other feels refined. The difference is not the event itself, but the inner position each person occupies when the event arrives. When you assume the world is against you, setbacks feel like confirmation. Delays feel intentional. Neutral responses feel cold. But if you assume life is responsive, not hostile, the same moments carry different information. A closed door becomes feedback. A delay becomes timing. A challenge becomes an invitation to adjust rather than a verdict on your worth. The body reveals this difference immediately. When you believe you are under attack, tension rises. The nervous system shifts into defense. Creativity narrows. Vision contracts. You react instead of respond. But when you view life as feedback, curiosity replaces fear. You ask, what is this showing me? Rather than why is this happening to me? That single shift opens space. Feedback implies participation. It suggests that your inner state, expectations, and assumptions are in conversation with experience. Not blame, not guilt, but involvement. Life is not punishing you for past mistakes. It is reflecting your current orientation. And reflection can be adjusted. That is the power hidden in this perspective. Most people resist this idea because it feels like responsibility without control. But it's actually responsibility with freedom. If circumstances were attacking you, you would be powerless. But if they are responding, then change is possible, not by forcing the world to behave differently, but by altering the inner stance that the world is responding to. When something doesn't go as planned, the question is not what did I do wrong, but what assumption might this be echoing? That question removes drama and invites clarity. It turns frustration into information. And information is useful. It tells you where your expectations are still misaligned with what you say you want. The moment you stop fighting life, life stops feeling like a fight. When you meet circumstances as messages rather than threats, they soften, they move, they resolve, not because the world suddenly became kind, but because you are no longer interpreting its responses as attacks. And in that shift, life begins to cooperate, not because it was convinced, but because it was never resisting you in the first place. A belief does not become powerful the moment you think it. It becomes powerful the moment you repeat it. Repetition is what gives an idea weight, density, and authority. A single thought passes through the mind like a cloud. A repeated thought settles like weather. Over time, it becomes the atmosphere you live in, shaping what feels normal, expected, and real. The mind is not designed to judge truth. It is designed to accept familiarity. Whatever you consistently turn to, mentally, emotionally, imaginatively, begins to feel factual. This is why beliefs formed in moments of emotion or repetition outlast logic. You may logically know something is possible, but if you have repeatedly rehearsed the opposite, logic will feel weak and distant. Familiarity always feels more convincing than reason. Repetition doesn't require effort. It happens through inner dialogue, mental images, remembered conversations, and imagined futures. Every time you replay a past disappointment, you are reinforcing an assumption about how things go for you. Every time you mentally prepare for rejection, you are rehearsing an outcome before it happens. The mind does not distinguish between preparation and prediction. It treats both as training. Over time, repetition builds expectation. Expectation builds behavior. Behavior builds results. This is how belief turns into fact without ever being questioned. You don't wake up one day deciding to limit yourself. You simply keep returning to the same inner narrative until it feels obvious. And once it feels obvious, It stops being challenged. This is why change often feels unnatural at first. A new assumption lacks repetition. It feels thin, artificial, and unstable. The old belief feels solid, even if it's painful. Pain that is familiar feels safer than possibility that is unfamiliar. So the mind pulls you back to what it knows, not because it's true, but because it's rehearsed. Repetition also shapes identity. You don't just believe something, you become someone who believes it. The inner story hardens into this is who I am, or this is how life works. And identity is powerful because it governs choice automatically. You don't debate actions that align with identity, you act them out instinctively. The outer world mirrors this consistency. When a belief is repeated internally, it expresses externally through tone, posture, timing, and attention. You notice what matches your belief and overlook what doesn't. Opportunities that contradict your assumption pass by unnoticed, while evidence that supports it feels obvious and plentiful. The world appears to agree, but it is only echoing what has been practiced. To change a belief, you don't argue with it. You out-repeat it. You introduce a new inner experience and return to it deliberately, not emotionally. You think it when it feels unconvincing. You imagine it when it feels premature. You allow it to be awkward and unfamiliar. Repetition is what gives it substance. Eventually, the new assumption begins to feel normal. And when it feels normal, life rearranges itself to match it. Not because something external changed first, but because repetition quietly transformed an idea into a lived reality. Most people try to change their lives by wrestling with the outside world. They adjust routines, chase strategies, and wait for circumstances to cooperate. When results don't change, frustration follows and effort intensifies. But the mistake is subtle and persistent. The outer world is being treated as the cause when it is actually the effect. What you see around you is not the starting point. It is the continuation of an inner story already in motion. Every external situation begins as an internal agreement. Long before something shows up as an event, it exists as an expectation, a feeling of normalcy, a quiet sense of what is likely or unlikely. This inner story shapes perception first. You don't see the world objectively, you see it selectively. Your assumptions decide what stands out, what feels relevant, and what you ignore. And perception quietly guides behavior. When the inner story says, this is hard, effort feels heavy. When it says, this never lasts, joy feels cautious. When it says, I'm not chosen, opportunities feel accidental or temporary. None of these reactions are deliberate. They are automatic responses to an internal narrative that has already defined the meaning of events before they unfold. Trying to fix the outer world without changing the inner story is like editing the reflection instead of the source. You may get temporary results through force, luck, or timing, but the pattern returns. The same types of challenges reappear. The same emotional loops repeat. This is not bad luck. It is consistency. The inner story is simply expressing itself again in a new form. The moment the inner story shifts, the outer story loses its momentum. When you change what you assume about yourself, you move differently. Your decisions soften or sharpen. Your tolerance for certain experiences changes. You stop entertaining situations that no longer match your self-concept. And without effort, your environment begins to reorganize around this new standard. This is not about positive thinking or denial. It is about alignment. A changed inner story doesn't pretend circumstances don't exist. It assigns them a different meaning. A delay is no longer proof of failure. A challenge is no longer a signal to retreat. Because the inner agreement has changed, the interpretation changes, and interpretation directs response. When response changes, outcomes follow. People react differently to you because you are meeting them from a different assumption. Opportunities appear because you are available to notice them. Boundaries strengthen because you no longer negotiate against yourself internally. The outer world reflects this shift naturally, without needing to be forced. The most powerful changes often feel subtle at first. Nothing dramatic happens immediately, but there is a quiet sense of inevitability. Things that once required effort begin to feel easier. Situations that once lingered resolve more quickly. Certain problems simply stop showing up, not because they were fought, but because they no longer match the inner story being lived. Change always moves from the inside out. When the inner story changes, the outer story must follow, not as a reward, not as a miracle, but as a natural consequence, because life can only reflect the version of you that you are consistently assuming yourself to be. Most people live inside their assumptions without ever seeing them. Thoughts feel like facts. Reactions feel justified. Emotional responses feel automatic and unavoidable. This is not because there is no choice, but because the choice is hidden. Awareness is the moment the hidden becomes visible, and visibility changes everything. The instant you notice an assumption, it stops being absolute. It may still feel convincing, but it is no longer unquestioned. That single shift from unconscious to conscious creates space, and in that space, freedom appears. Not freedom from circumstances, but freedom from being ruled by the interpretation of them. Before awareness, assumptions operate like laws. They dictate behavior without explanation. You don't ask why you hesitate, why you settle, why you expect less. You simply feel that it's reasonable. Awareness interrupts this automatic authority. It introduces a pause, and in that pause you can observe rather than obey. Awareness is not about fixing or correcting in the moment, it's about seeing clearly. When you notice yourself thinking, "This always happens to me," you are no longer fully inside the thought. You are standing slightly outside it, watching it arise. That separation weakens its grip. You are no longer the assumption. You are the one observing it. This is why awareness alone can be transformative. You don't need to immediately replace the assumption with a better one. The act of noticing already changes the relationship. What was once an unquestioned truth becomes a mental pattern. And patterns can be altered. Without awareness, change feels exhausting. You try to override reactions through effort and discipline, but effort works against the current of assumption. Awareness changes the current itself. When you see the source, you don't need to fight the symptom. The reaction loses its urgency because it no longer feels inevitable. Awareness also returns choice to moments that used to feel automatic. You catch yourself bracing for disappointment. You notice the familiar emotional tone rising, and instead of being carried by it, you recognize it as an old assumption replaying itself. That recognition alone creates a fork in the road. You may still feel the emotion, but you are no longer compelled to act from it. This is where freedom becomes practical, not dramatic, not philosophical, but usable. You can respond instead of react. You can experiment with a new expectation instead of defaulting to the old one. You can pause long enough to choose a different inner position, even if it feels unfamiliar. Over time, repeated awareness rewires habit. What you once didn't see becomes obvious. What once felt natural begins to feel optional. You start catching assumptions earlier, before they fully color experience. And as this skill develops, your life feels less predetermined and more responsive. Freedom doesn't come from controlling every thought. It comes from recognizing that thoughts are not commands. Awareness reveals this truth experientially, not intellectually. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it, because the moment an assumption is visible, it can no longer quietly decide your life for you.